So our purpose now is to discuss this paradox a little bit, but you also might introduce yourselves as to who you are and a little bit about where your expertise is. So do you want to start?
Sure. Well, my name is Dirk PILAT. I work at the OECD, which is an international organization based in Paris. Great to be in Montpellier, I must say. My job is really around sort of a lot of the work which we do at the OECD is trying to give advice to governments on what they need to do around digital economy. So we do a lot of work on trust, on privacy, security, but also trying to understand what is the digital economy actually doing for growth and for jobs and for skills. So we need to understand that because I think a lot of countries are struggling with this issue, and that's really what we're about at the moment. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second.
Okay. Georg?
Thanks so much. So I'm an assistant professor at Uppsala University in Sweden and also affiliated with the Center for Economic Performance at the LSE. And my research is about the impact of technological change on productivity and on the labor market.
Okay, so maybe we'll let you start off and to explain this paradox for us of why we see all this technology, but we still, at least according to Professor Gordon, have a stagnant economic growth.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, please.
Right, so I think there may be two ways of looking at this. So one way has to do with measurement. As has been mentioned before, it's very difficult to measure economic activity, and maybe it's getting increasingly difficult because many of the new goods, many of the new services that we consume are free. So how do you measure the value added of something if it doesn't have a price? It's also difficult to say what the contribution of a new technology is to productivity growth because standard data sources, for example, the measurement of capital inputs in the national accounts lag behind new technologies. For a very long time, ICT wasn't captured in the national accounts. I've done some research with Guy Michaels at the LSE on the impact of industrial robots on productivity. And again, there is no measure of the use of industrial robots in standard data sources. So we went to, we found a new data source. The International Federation of Robotics has put together this database on deliveries of industrial robots to many industries and countries. Starting in the 1990s, we have this data on the number of robots delivered in each year, and we use that to construct a measure of how many robots are used in a given industry. And we found that there's been a huge impact of industrial robots on productivity, explaining about 1/6 of aggregate productivity growth since the early 1990s. And this is something that was, this kind of research we could only do because of this new database. Still, if you go to standard data sources, you find a breakdown of the capital input into ICT and non-ICT. And it just so happens that the robots are counted as non-ICT, which also includes cars and all kinds of old-fashioned tools. So it's, for that reason, in a way, measurement always lags behind, and it's always going to be difficult to to say, okay, yes, we have this new technology. It went on the market it was launched last year. So what's the impact of it? Well, it's going to be really, really difficult to say in many cases.
But to follow on to that, you must have seen some decline in the amount of labor applied to manufacturing a certain thing with all the robot technology. Did you look at that and see how much the robots are replacing humans?
Right, so we also looked at that. That was our second big question, sort of what the impact of robots was on employment. And it sort of connects to these old fears that, as technology gets better and better at doing, things
humans go away.
Yeah. Now, this has been going on, of course, for more than 200 years, right? And robots are sort of the latest installment in this sort of sequence of technologies. Each vintage a little bit better at replacing humans. But of course, so far, we haven't seen, mass unemployment and job destruction on a massive scale. And in fact, in our research, we also didn't see that. So in the aggregate, there was no effect of robots on employment, on total hours worked. And one reason, of course, is that as you start using these robots in your plant, you become more productive, you sell at a lower price, you capture a larger share of the market, so you expand.
But could we, at least in the United States and actually in many countries, going back to Piketty, his story is that we know that the real wage in the U.S. has been flat for 30 years. And one of the problems with the last great recessions was that people were using their houses as their cash machine, and because they didn't have an increase in real income. Could that possibly be explained in part by the robotics?
Yes, unfortunately it could. So that's sort of the twist on our findings about the impact on employment, is that even there is no aggregate effect, there are distributional effects. So low-skilled workers seem to be hurt by robots in the sense that their employment goes down relative to high-skilled workers. And again, this is sort of a theme that research on the impact of technological change on the labor market has focused on a lot. What's the distributional impact? And actually, in the case of ICT, what researchers have found is that it's the people in the middle of the skill distribution that were hurt the most. Think of accountants or office clerks, some semi-skilled work in manufacturing. That was where the biggest impact was of ICT. Now, in the case of the robots, it's sort of more old-fashioned skill-based technological change where the low-skill workers seem to be hurt.
Of course, the robots need software engineers and so forth to drive that technology. Dirk, did you have any comments on that?
Well, perhaps a few points to make from the beginning. I mean, I think part of the problem, I think we've been looking a little bit at the wrong place. I think it's very hard to look at the relationship between productivity growth and information technology at a very aggregate level, because I think we really need to understand there are some firms which are doing extremely well in using this technology and making it work and having all the investment which are needed to make it work in terms of skills, in terms of organizational changes, process innovation, things like that. There are other firms who have more difficulty in doing that. And I think we see that when we look more into a micro story, where we try to look into the firms which are using this technology very intensively. A lot of those firms actually see also the increase in productivity. There's another part of the economy where that is not happening. And I think that's where some of the paradox to me lies, because we've done a little bit of work, and that's in the journal which was presented earlier on today, where we found a really big gap opening up between those firms which are able to increase productivity and those firms which are not able to do it. And this sounds like an abstract debate sometimes. I mean, I'm an economist by training, and well, why would we care? But it does come back to the issue about incomes. It does come to the issue about wages, because one of the reasons why we probably think that in the United States, for instance, we've seen that also there are a lot of firms which are able to increase productivity, and they can increase wages as well. Whereas we have other firms which are not able to do that, and then also the wages will be staying behind. So I think it is one of the factors which is adding to some of the issues which Piketty is raising as well. The other thing I think I find we are a little bit too focused on the technology as such. I think there is a lot of going on here, and of course, I mean, from the examples we've been hearing here today, there is a lot of value creation happening in companies. There's a lot of technological change. But I think if you look at the company level, if you look at the economy-wide level, it needs to be complemented with other things to really make it work and to increase productivity. And that's skills, it's education, it's organizational change. And in many countries, we probably don't always have all the policies, the frameworks in place to make that happen. So the education system doesn't really allow that. The regulations don't really work. There is not enough competition in the economy. There's not enough organizational change happening in the economy. All these different things, I think, really explain perhaps why we have this paradox, and those are some of the things I think we need to focus on.
Well, you're Mr. Doom and Gloom again then, right?
No, not at all. I don't think it's a doom and gloom story. I think it's a story about.
Is it a question of the dynamics of the economic environment changing, that it's resistant in regulatory change, it's resistant in educational structure?
To me, this is a story. We have probably one of the biggest transformation in our economies going on as we've ever had. And in terms of digital, is big. It's really big. It's changing our economies. But I think still a lot of governments have difficulty catching up with it. And that means that the policies we have in place in many cases are not able to keep up. And that means that some of the things we actually need to do to make this technology work for everybody are not being done. And so I think we need to really work on that and not see this as just a technical issue, but really see it as a very strategic issue for firms, and I think some firms are doing that, but also for an economy.
Yeah, well, for governments.
For policy, for governments,
I would say.
Yeah.
And we heard a story yesterday about trying to roll out really high-speed broadband throughout all the colleges in the U.S. On the part of Brian Levin, and one of the issues was that they were blocked by the states, the various rules of the states of the United States that were impeding some of the rollout of that technology. So if you had your hat on as a policymaker, what would be the 2 or 3 changes that you would like to see? You could wait for that question too.
Well, a few of them I think came up in some of the discussions early on. I think the regulatory side is very important. I think to really keep up with what technology is allowing, and that's always difficult. I mean, I was in Paris in June when we had the strikes against Uber. These are things where I think governments have difficulty with. How do you deal with some of these very disruptive companies? How do you regulate them? What do you allow? What do you not allow? But I think it is, if we want to really see the benefits, we need to think about the right regulation to enable some of these things to happen. The second thing is really around skills. I mean, we do a lot of work at work on education and skills, and we looked at adult skills, and you find basically that only about 1/3 of the workforce has the skills to really benefit and use technologies and apply it, which means that if we expect more to come, and I think there's a lot more to come, and we heard that from the previous discussion, then I think you really need to do a lot more on the skills and education side, because otherwise you will have a lot of people left behind, and we will have really also these problems with unemployment for certain groups. And then I think a third issue is around big challenges around privacy, security, and trust. And because I think this is becoming more important, we also need to ensure the trust issue. And that, of course, is a very tricky one to get right, but I think it is a very important one as well. So those are 3 things I would think about.
We'll come back to that one too. Yeah. And George, what do you think? You agree with Dirk?
Yes, especially on the issue of education. So I think the things that even primary school children learn, there's probably a lot that should change. They should probably start coding and programming at a very early age. Then you can think of policies to help people who sort of jobs disappear, because this is something that, as we said before, has been going on for a long time, and to take some of so there is going to be winners and losers from technological change, and it would be good if there were policies that help people retrain, and in general policies, but the education system in particular can sort of try to make sure that people become better at adapting to sort of changing economic environment. An interesting issue, which I think is going to be more and more talked about, is quite controversial, is the minimum wage. So there's very, very little research on sort of what is the impact of raising the minimum wage on companies' propensity to adopt labor-replacing technologies. But the early sort of studies that are there sort of point in the direction that, well, it's as you would expect, that higher minimum wages lead to fast adoption of these technologies. And so if you were thinking about, helping low-income workers, maybe the minimum wage isn't the best policy. There are probably other things that you might do. But again, this is...
Spoken like a true economist, right? Those downward sloping demand curves and supply curves. But I think there is some research that suggests that the minimum wage doesn't reduce employment as much as the abstract supply and demand equations would suggest. And so we now, at least in the United States, have a push to get minimum wage in many different states. California, of course, is the big model to do that. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because we'll have presumably have some good data to look at that point. But I thought the two of you might address the structural issues that Professor Gordon addressed in terms of the education attainment. I mean, his notion was that the U.S. is not getting the same level of education before, but your solutions to some of these problems are better and different education as well, a different mix of education than it had been in the past. So could either of you comment on that?
Well, perhaps one thing to say is I don't think it's just about education. I mean, education is a pretty
I agree.
No, but also education is a very passive thing. You give people something at the beginning of their lives, and basically that's supposed to serve them over a lot of years. And I think we are now in a situation that many people change jobs all the time. Jobs
7 times.
change very quickly. I think we have, if you look at about the occupations in the United States at the moment, 20% of them didn't exist 5 years ago in terms of how many new jobs and new types of jobs come in all the time. That means that people have to reskill and learn new things all the time, and our systems are not really suited for that. We still have a system where basically you get educated at the beginning, and then, well, you're supposed to serve, and you're supposed to figure out how you're going to do it. And of course, there are some trainings in companies, and there's some trainings which you can do yourself, but I don't think we've really done that well on that either. The other thing we're looking at the OECD is we also find a lot of people are actually in jobs where sometimes they're much more qualified in the job they're in, and sometimes they're underqualified for a job they're in. So a lot of people are sometimes stuck in jobs where they really don't want to be in. And how you allow that mobility to happen, how do you make that easier, is another part of it. So I think skills is a very big issue. It's one where I think we need to get right. We're working with countries at the moment to try and develop more broader skill strategies, which is much more than just education, to try and sort of work on that area, because I think that's a really crucial issue.
Are those strategies at the K through 12 level, or outside of that?
It's from the beginning,
structure?
Because basically, I think one of the things we found as well, if you really want to, teachers are really important, but also sort of starting very early is really important. Really, I mean, often really starting at 3 or 4 years old to really work with people and to educate them, and at a very early stage.
Well, there's been a lot of research that shows that that's very fruitful to get kids started very early, and we have a lot of resistance in the U.S. against doing that. But you have any comments on the education side?
I second what Dirk said, so he's the expert on this.
Dirk expresses himself very well. So we have to. I see a systemic problem in the U.S. on education. So that's one area. We have issues of regulation which move very slowly. Any comments on that part of the picture? I mean, at one time we went through this whole liberalization area where we don't have any regulation at all, but yet, or at least that was the model, and that's gone in some places beyond where it should, perhaps. So there's now seems to be a movement back towards more regulation. How would you design the new regulatory framework?
Well, I think what some countries are trying to do is what they call smart regulation, which is probably opposed to stupid regulation, but at least it's the idea
it has the right adjective.
But I think to try and think about regulation in a slightly different way, which is, I mean, for instance, in some cases, we've had very much performance-based regulation, like, we've had regulation which was sometimes very sort of specific about what you needed to do to qualify for something. And I think now that's moving a little bit more into trying to do it in a way that allows much more innovation to happen. So more regulation which can be much more innovative in terms of what companies can do in that space. I think that's one element of making that happen. I mean, the other area where we are doing a lot of work is around sort of the whole issue of telecommunications regulation and keeping up with internet regulation, because I mean, this is moving so quickly. So to make sure that we keep competition in those markets, that we basically allow the changes to happen, allow the innovation to happen, that means you constantly have to look for new models and new ways of doing it. For instance, one of the issues which we've been recommending to countries is basically it's very good to have 4 mobile operators in your country, because really it makes a difference in terms of how much competition there is. It makes a difference in terms of how much prices are actually going down. Right. If you have 3, you're more likely to have a bit more of a monopolistic situation. So competition is one element. To try and get enough competition in your market is one element, I think, of making it
But
work.
we also heard from one of the former speakers that the supply side, which would be that those telecommunications companies are condensing, and so there's going to be a price squeeze, I would suspect, on the chip manufacturers in that case.
Yeah. Well, there is
that was a comment, not a question.
There is one broader issue here, and I think it was raised by Yves in his presentation of Julius Setz's paper, and I think you raised it as well on Bob Gordon's paper, is that we're seeing across the OECD countries, not only in the US, we see the number of startup companies going down. So basically, even though we would expect, well, IT is allowing many different firms to come in, we still see that the number of startup companies seems to have gone down. And it started before the crisis, it still seems to be continuing. And we're not quite sure why that is happening. I mean, why we do not see more innovative companies sort of coming up. I mean, some of them are coming up, but why this is going down is sometimes feels a bit like it's not what you would expect. And you can always argue about the numbers, but it's something which we just don't know quite what it's doing. And I think you really
well, is that perhaps a result of some consolidations and I'll put it in quotes, anti-competitive practice by some of the big players that
well, the big players are definitely buying the smaller players. That's of course a lot of the big players are buying the smaller players, and of course that's definitely what's happening. But you would still see the startup come. You might not see it later on because it may have been bought by somebody, but you would still see the startup. So I don't think that's explaining it, but it's something which is a little worrying, because I think this has really been the source of a lot of the new innovations as well over the years in terms of new business models, new ideas, and new technologies. So I think that's something we need to look into as well, where that comes from.
Let's turn to the quality of the statistics maybe and talk about that for a while. Do you have any, I mean, I have some strong feelings. I recently proctored a dissertation on trying to measure happiness in the economy, and we don't have really good measures of not just happiness, but quality improvements in the products. I mean, the iPhone from 2007 has certainly changed to today's iPhone, and as a consequence, you have a lot more functionality, a lot more innovations within the iPhone, but still it goes into the GDP accounts as this price that you paid in 2007 or 2014. I'm not sure what probably not much difference given that it was Apple, at least in that case. So there is those issues. What have you seen other issues that you can kind of identify where the statistics could be improved or are not measuring what we would like to measure in terms of quality, standard of living and so forth?
So one aspect is free goods we talked about, and there's actually something you can do.
I want to come back to that because
Okay.
I had a different view on that.
Right.
Yes, it's free, but if you go to Facebook, it's free, but then you have to sort through all those ads, and there is a revenue side to Facebook, there's a revenue side to Google, all of these quote free apps have revenue behind them, which does get measured. So they're not free. In fact, it may have a high opportunity cost to the user that is not measured as well. So I wanted to stop you earlier on when you said free goods, but as economists know, there's no free lunch.
No, that's true. But I agree with that. No, but on the topic of opportunity cost of consumers, this is actually how Austin Goolsbee and Pete Kleno tried to measure the value of the consumer surplus of the internet is using time use studies. How much time do people spend on the internet? You know, what's the opportunity cost of their time, their wages, of course. So given these numbers under some assumptions about preferences, you know, how big is the internet in terms of consumer surplus? And it turns out this is not that big. It's, you know, less than a % of GDP, I think. So to the extent that, you know, people try to improve the statistics, is actually, you know, what was found, it didn't look so great. On the other hand, you know, it could be that we have a true slowdown in productivity growth at the same time as we have rapid innovation. And that's just because it takes firms a long time to figure out how to use all these new technologies. That's and while they're doing that, they're not, you know, improving existing processes. So you might have these so-called Schumpeterian waves. You have creative destruction. But, you know, that means once an older technology is replaced, you know, it takes some time for firms to figure out how to use new technologies. And I think that could be true nowadays. I think what's happening in software is sort of a bit misleading. There you have these incredibly fast-growing businesses, you know, but it's a very special kind of business model where you have, you know, instant feedback from the consumers, where it's very cheap to try things out, and it's very fast to scale up the product, which isn't true of, you know, for all the other innovations that are incoming, like the driverless car, drones, new materials, and so on. And this is also where regulation comes in, because regulation needs time, you know, independently of this question, okay, you know, what to do to avoid stupid regulation. I think in many of these cases, take the driverless car, it's not obvious at all what regulation should look like. Traffic that, you know, where you only have driverless cars is probably much more efficient in many ways than a situation where you mix you know, human drivers with the driverless cars. So what's the regulator going to do?
Yeah, well, I think somebody said that Uber is trying to get a driverless car faster than Google so that they can, because they see there's a really competitive threat if you have these little autonomous cars running around and picking up people, but it would also be one of those very disruptive technology if you now put it in the context of a shared economy where we don't need a car because we can call an autonomous car and use it on demand, whereas we really don't. We keep a car in the garage and only use it 5 or 10% of the time.
I have a question. Maybe other people have a question.
Do we have a mic, please?
May I have the mic open?
It's not up here.
Okay.
Down here, please.
Thank you. A well-known French economist, Daniel Cohen, was explaining 2 weeks ago that robotics is a difference of nature compared to the technical digital innovation we have seen till now. But during the last year, digital innovation was a new tool productivity added to the work of the human. But we are in a new situation when we are talking about robotics. Do you share this difference of nature between this new wave of robotics that we are waiting for and the last 2 decades of innovation in the digital world?
It's hard to say, but there are signs that, you know, it's not as big a revolution as you might think. With robots at this point, the issue is still that you need to, you know, they're not as flexible as you would like them to be. They're fixed in position most of the time, so you sort of rearrange your whole factory, you know, so it can work only using robots but not humans. Now, what if you want to change the kind of product that you're producing? You know, then you need to rearrange everything once again. They're not as flexible yet. In general, you know, software, you know, there are many examples of software, you know, becoming much better, but it's highly specialized. So it's not, you know, like a chess program. You know, it can't drive your Google car. There is no instances of true artificial intelligence yet. And so, you know, maybe that's coming in 20 or 30 years, but to me, it's not obvious that that's around the corner.
Perhaps just to add a few things. I mean, I think also, I'm not sure if robotics is that much bigger than some of the other things we're seeing. I mean, I think we put out a report in beginning of October on the role of data, and which I think is really affecting every part of the economy in many different ways. And I think digital has many different forms and many different applications throughout the economy. Now, robotics, I think, perhaps gets a little bit of extra attention because also it's seen as affecting industry a lot more, and perhaps in terms of affecting more jobs in industry. And I think we still have a bit of a focus on jobs in industry where robotics could really change that even more than it has been changed already. I think I believe that manufacturing will remain important, but perhaps the jobs will no longer be so much in production. They will be around it. They will be more around the services, about the knowledge and production and so on. And in that sense, I mean, I think robotics is a big thing. There are still a few. I think also the applications, for instance, in hospitals are very interesting and important ones. So there are many different things. But whether it's completely something we need to look at separately from all the other different digital things which are going on, I'm not sure about that.
Well, and I would just add that artificial intelligence AI is much broader than just the robotics, and there are many people working on different ways of looking at artificial intelligence. So it's, I think one of the citations is in Gasson's introduction.
I have another question. During the lunch, I was talking with a speaker this morning, and he was talking about a paper he has seen in a newspaper, French newspaper this morning, Les Echos, a paper of Professor Landier of Toulouse School of Economics. And I did not see this paper, but he was explaining that for this professor, it was crazy to see that the European countries try to push all the money towards a startup. Firstly, because there is a very big risk to be in front of a bubble crisis in the next years. And secondly, because it's not within the what we can present as a competitive advantage of the European countries. And he seemed to join some people like Larry Summers, who explained that very often the problem is a misallocation of capital. And it will be better to invest in infrastructure, transport, and in fiber optic, because we are here in the DigiWorld Summit, rather than to fund a new digital platform. Do we have some comments to add to this?
Well, it's hard to comment on a paper which you haven't read, but
Yeah.
I would just say...
that's the easy part.
I would just say
the core of today.
I would just say on
I
the
will read it
role
too.
we're doing some work at the moment on the role of different types of firms at the moment and trying to understand better where growth comes from, where productivity comes from, where jobs come from. And in that work, we typically find that young firms, new firms, less than 5 years old, this is basically where most of the jobs in economies come from. So they play a very important role. They also, I think, play a very important role sometimes in bringing in new ideas into the economy. And I think Europe probably doesn't do as well with those types of firms as it could. And I think there are reasons for that. I think sometimes the regulations we have in place don't allow these firms to grow as quickly. It's not always as easy. We still have a bit of a culture which is more against experimentation than it is in the United States. I'm not saying we need to go to the United States, but I think there are things which can be done to allow those firms to grow more than they're currently growing in European countries. That doesn't mean pushing a lot of money towards them, because I think that is something you always have to, and particularly governments, I think, have to be very careful with, because as you say, you can sometimes create bubbles, and I don't think the problem is necessarily one of money. It is in some cases, but there are other problems which I think need to be looked at as well. I agree. I mean, I think on the investment side, I think, perhaps we're not spending enough yet on new forms of infrastructure, on smart infrastructure in Europe. So perhaps that's something where we could do a bit more.
Okay, my alarm went off, and that was my signal that I would open the floor to questions. So we'll anybody out there that has some questions? I see Jessica running with a
Je
mic.
crois qu'on a épuisé peut-être depuis plus de 2 jours toute notre assistance. Comme on dit en français, les meilleures choses ont une fin. Thank you very much for your participation. It was very interesting. Merci beaucoup. On essaie de respecter les horaires parce que, vous le savez, il y a un bus pour ceux qui doivent partir sur l'aéroport qui va partir dans 5 minutes, 4h05, donc c'est trop tard ou pas? Non, c'est encore bon. Si c'était trop tard, on aurait pu continuer, mais vous avez encore la chance de pouvoir prendre le bus. Merci beaucoup. C'était la dernière séquence de cette DigiWorld Summit. Il y aura d'autres rendez-vous dans l'année avec l'IDAT. Sinon, c'est l'année prochaine, le 18 et le 19 novembre, je crois. Voilà, très bon retour à tous.